The rain had been falling since dawn, streaking the tall courthouse windows like tears that refused to dry. Inside, the grand hall buzzed with polished shoes, case files, and tension. Everything about the building screamed prestige: marble floors, brass railings, portraits of judges long gone, all white-haired, all white. The scent of wet umbrellas mixed with old books and the faint aftershave of men who had sat in the same leather chairs for decades. Amara stepped through the heavy doors with quiet precision. She didn't hesitate, but neither did she rush. Her posture, though upright, held the subtle stiffness of someone who knew too well what it meant to be watched. Her black robe flowed behind her like a wave of defiance against everything this place had once represented. It was not just fabric stitched with authority, it was armor against every glance that had dismissed her, every smirk that had underestimated her, every voice that once sneered, "You don't belong here." She walked past rows of attorneys, some rising from their seats out of habit, others caught mid-conversation, their words drying on their tongues when they noticed who she was. Not just that she was a woman, not just that she was young, but because she was a woman who looked like her, skin deep like bronze, hair braided and gathered at the back of her head with deliberate care, eyes focused not on them but ahead, where justice lived in no color at all. The courtroom waited, and inside it waited him, Charles Redmond, 63. Partner of Redmond and Price, a towering figure in litigation with a record that stretched across 3 states and more than 40 years. A man used to winning, used to people like Amara, holding the door open, taking notes at the edge of the room, never speaking unless spoken to. He sat at the defendant's table in a charcoal suit and a frown carved so deep it might never leave. There was no doubt in his posture. He didn't rise. He didn't flinch. He simply looked, the kind of look that could gut a soul if it weren't forged in fire. Years ago, he had humiliated her. It was at a legal conference, back when she was still a rising star fresh from law school. She had asked a question during the panel he sat on, her hand lifted with the same precision as her arguments. His response hadn't been about the question. It had been about her voice, her tone, the audacity to speak with such certainty. He had chuckled, leaned back, and said something that made the room laugh. It wasn't funny. It was surgical. A removal of her place in that space. She had smiled back then, small, tight, and practiced. Then she had walked away and never looked back. Until now. She ascended the bench. The bailiff announced the session. Papers shuffled. Footsteps adjusted. Every sound was magnified in the quiet that followed her name. Judge Amara Bell. The first in the county. The youngest ever appointed to her seat. The only one in the building whose picture hadn't yet made it to the wall, but whose presence was now burned into its future. She didn't need to speak to control the room. She didn't need to shout to command respect. She sat, and with that simple motion, centuries of exclusion shifted slightly. Her eyes moved across the courtroom with discipline, not defiance. She acknowledged the prosecution, then the defense. When her gaze settled on Charles Redmond, there was no emotion in it. Not coldness. Not warmth. Just history, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. The kind that seeps into woodwork and skin, the kind that says, "We've been here before, but not like this." The charges were clear: witness tampering, coercion, and falsified evidence in a civil case that had led to wrongful conviction. Evidence had surfaced years later, suppressed emails, vanished records, all traced back to the very firm he led. He denied everything. Of course he did. Men like him always did. Not because they believed themselves innocent, but because the courtroom had never been designed to hold them accountable. But now it had. Amara let the opening arguments unfold without interruption. Her fingers hovered over the bench as she listened. She didn't write notes. She didn't need to. She remembered everything. Not just the case, but the weight behind every word spoken in a space that still tried to pretend justice was blind. She remembered the looks of the jury, the shuffle of the paralegal's feet, the way the clerk's voice cracked slightly every time they read her name aloud. She remembered her first day in this very courthouse. Not as a judge, not even as an attorney, but as a law student sitting quietly in the back row. She had worn her best shoes, had taken the bus from the south side, had clutched her resume with hands that wouldn't stop sweating. And that day, Charles Redmond had passed her in the hallway, looked her over and walked right by. Now he sat below her, not beneath her. The bench did that on its own, but within reach of a system that for once might actually do what it promised. The morning passed. Testimonies began. Objections rose and fell like waves against a stone. But Amara didn't waver. She watched. She ruled. She maintained order not with volume but with presence. The gavel was silent. She didn't need to raise it yet. Authority, when it is real, doesn't shout. It waits. It listens. It knows its time will come. And so did she. By the second day of trial, the air inside the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just the scent of brewed coffee and damp coats that lingered in the walls. It was something less tangible, the recognition of power in an unexpected form. The kind of recognition that makes people nervous, not because it's loud or aggressive, but because it doesn't flinch when expected to fold. Judge Amara Bell entered without spectacle, but every head still turned. The black robe didn't change, the leather-bound docket she carried didn't change, but the perception had begun to. The murmurs that followed her yesterday had grown quieter, more uncertain. The defense team, once confident, now cast glances that lingered a beat too long, waiting to catch a mistake, a hesitation, a crack. But there were none. She sat at the bench with the same calm deliberateness, her gavel still untouched, her voice still measured. She ruled with precision, and with a kind of restraint that unnerved the ones who had only ever known authority through domination. She was not here to perform. She was here to decide. Across from her, Charles Redmond sat straighter than before. His suit had changed, now a deeper gray, the tie a careful blue meant to soften, to humanize. His expression was carved from granite, impassive, but not unfeeling. Underneath that stillness was calculation. He had spent a lifetime controlling narratives, reading juries, bending truth just far enough to win without being caught. But now, for the first time in decades, he wasn't directing the room. He was surviving in it. Amara watched as the prosecution presented evidence, email records, depositions, witness timelines. The jury leaned forward, their attention tugged not just by the facts but by the weight of the suggestion that the man before them had knowingly sabotaged justice. It was not a case of negligence. It was a case of manipulation, and every detail dripped with intention. The witness stand rotated with former employees, paralegals, a whistleblower whose voice cracked with guilt. Amara tracked every word, not just for its legality, but for its tone, its silences. She understood what wasn't said just as clearly as what was. Years of being the only one like her in the room had sharpened that skill. She could read tension like a second language. Her hands remained folded as the court reporter's fingers flew over keys. She let the attorneys rise and fall in their rhythm, let the weight of their performance echo against the wood-paneled walls. The room was a stage and she, the final editor. Every time a moment teetered toward chaos, her voice cut through. Steady, restrained, final. Redmond's attorney attempted to discredit the whistleblower. He framed her as disgruntled, as opportunistic. But the room felt the fracture. A subtle recoil in the jury box, a glance exchanged between clerks. It was too rehearsed, too familiar. The strategy that once worked now felt dated under Amara's gaze. During the recess, Amara walked alone to her chambers. The corridors of the courthouse echoed with footsteps, distant and hollow. The paintings on the walls, former judges, all stern and alabaster, watched her with eyes that had never imagined someone like her in their company. But she didn't look away. Inside her chambers, silence reigned. The walls were lined with law books and soft lamps, and on her desk, a framed photo, her mother standing in front of their old apartment building, arms crossed, pride in her eyes despite the peeling paint and barred windows behind her. That woman never stepped foot in a courtroom. She had cleaned floors, raised children, endured humiliation from men who couldn't pronounce her name, but she had believed in her daughter. Amara closed her eyes for a moment and breathed. It wasn't a breath of exhaustion. It was one of memory, of grounding. Then she stood, adjusted her robe, and returned to the courtroom. The afternoon brought a surprise witness, a junior partner who had worked under Redmond for years. His testimony began like all the others, formal, cautious, tethered to the safety of neutrality. But then something shifted. He looked at Redmond, then at Amara, then at the jury, and he told the truth. About the closed-door meetings, the pressure to alter language, the way files were reorganized to confuse audit trails. He didn't accuse, he recounted. And that somehow was worse. It wasn't anger that made his words powerful. It was clarity. Redmond's jaw clenched. His attorney objected. Overruled. Amara's voice didn't rise. It never did. But when she spoke, the room obeyed. By the time court adjourned for the day, the weight of the case had settled into the walls like smoke. No one looked at Redmond the same way. He felt it too, not guilt, perhaps, but the erosion of inevitability. He was no longer the man who couldn't be touched. He was now just another defendant, sitting under the watchful eye of a judge who remembered everything. Amara remained behind after the room cleared. The gallery emptied, the bailiff stepped outside, the hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet. She walked down from the bench and stood in the space where Redmond had sat. She looked up at the seat she had occupied all day. It loomed now high, solemn, immutable. And she smiled. Not from pride, not from revenge, but from recognition. That no matter how many times they tried to move her to the margins, she was already seated at the center. And no one could take that from her. The third day of the trial began under a sharper light. Outside, the clouds had cleared, but inside the courthouse, the storm only deepened. The reporters were early now, clustered near the marble steps with their microphones and questions sharpened like blades. Something had shifted in the city. People were talking. Not just about the charges, not just about the man accused, but about her. They whispered her name as a challenge, as a problem, as a precedent. Amara walked past them untouched by the noise, her heels soft against the stone. Her robe brushed her calves in rhythm, and in her hand she carried no briefcase, no spectacle, only a folder, closed tight, filled not with vengeance but with structure. She had built her authority the long way, step by step, ruling by ruling, without the safety of legacy or the benefit of assumption. And now she would wield it carefully. Inside the courtroom, there was a tension that clung to the walls like static. Jurors spoke less. The defense table was lined with nervous glances and forced optimism. Charles Redmond sat with the posture of someone who had once commanded entire rooms with a single raised eyebrow, but now his expressions had dulled. There was less certainty in his eyes, more calculation, more restraint. He was beginning to understand the architecture of his downfall. Amara took the bench in silence. Her presence now felt elemental, not added to the room but inherent to it. Like air, like gravity. The kind of authority that no longer needed to prove itself because the room had already adapted. The prosecution continued with forensic evidence, financial ledgers that traced a history of settlements hidden in private accounts, metadata from altered deposition files, email timestamps that contradicted sworn statements. But it wasn't just the content. It was the narrative. Each thread wove a picture not of sloppiness, but of arrogance. Of a man who had operated for decades with the confidence that no one would question him because the system had been built in his image. And for so long, he had been right. But now the system stared back at him through the eyes of a judge who remembered every closed door, every rejected application, every polite smile wrapped around dismissal. During the recess, Amara stood at the tall windows overlooking the courthouse square. She watched a man help his daughter tie her shoe, a woman with a briefcase talking hurriedly on her phone, a delivery worker pushing a dolly over a crack in the pavement. She had lived this city, its weight and rhythm. She had walked through it unseen for most of her life. Not invisible, but overlooked. The memory of her first internship returned uninvited. Back when she was assigned to photocopy exhibits and take notes for men who never learned her name. When a senior partner had once asked her, in front of a room of executives, to refill his water, mistaking her not for a clerk or junior staff, but for the help. She had done it. She had poured the water. And then, the next week, she had submitted the draft that won the firm the case. No one thanked her. They didn't need to. They had taken what they needed and moved on. But she remembered. The second half of the day brought testimony from one of Redmond's former clients, a woman whose small business had been destroyed through litigation tactics designed not to win but to bury her in fees and paperwork. She spoke with composure, but her voice cracked near the end. The way Redmond had laughed at her during a deposition. The way his eyes had skipped past her, already claiming victory. Amara did not shift in her seat. She didn't nod, didn't betray sympathy. But inside her chest, something clenched. She knew what it meant to be laughed at. Not for what you said, but for daring to speak at all. The defense countered with cold logic, precedent, protocol, deniability. They leaned on ambiguity. They appealed to reason. They dissected her pain into fragments they could step over without guilt. But the jury saw it. They saw the contrast. Amara called for a short recess before closing arguments. The courtroom emptied slowly this time, like people unsure of how to breathe after holding it too long. She remained on the bench, still and watchful. She didn't think of Redmond anymore. She thought of the girls who might be watching this. The ones sitting on the floor of cramped apartments with textbooks balanced on their knees. The ones told to lower their voices, to smile more, to wait their turn, to survive, not to lead. She thought of her grandmother, who had picked cotton and never learned to read but had sent her mother to school. Of her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep their lights on and told her daughter, again and again, that her mind was her ticket out, that her mind would carry her further than anyone allowed, and when they slammed the door, she was to build her own and walk through it like it had always existed. Amara didn't feel small on that bench. She felt inevitable. And when the doors opened again and the courtroom refilled and Charles Redmond's lawyer rose for his final argument, Amara looked not at him, but at the jury. 12 citizens, ordinary and alert, and knew they saw what she saw. A man who had built his empire on shadows, and a woman who had stepped into the light. The courtroom was different now. Not in its architecture or temperature. The marble was still cold, the wood still polished, the flag still unmoving, but in its weight. Something invisible had shifted. The space no longer belonged to the defense, nor to the walls lined with silent portraits of past judges. It belonged to the moment, and that moment sat in a black robe, her hands resting still, her spine straight, her eyes forward. Amara listened as the final arguments began. The prosecutor, a younger man with a soft voice and an iron spine, rose first. He didn't perform. He didn't need to. The truth in its rawest form had already been laid bare over the last 3 days. His words wove the threads of facts into something undeniable, a pattern of abuse, of calculated obstruction, of deliberate cruelty masked as professionalism. He never raised his voice. But in that silence, the damage echoed louder than shouting ever could. Redmond watched without flinching. His expression had turned stoic again, pulled tight like a mask stretched over the truth. But the tremor in his fingertips as he adjusted his pen betrayed him. He knew the story had changed. Knew that in this room, for once, his version wasn't the one being believed. Then his attorney rose. The man was seasoned, with a voice like polished granite and a cadence designed to reassure. He didn't defend Redmond's actions, not directly. He defended the ambiguity. He painted the case as a misunderstanding, a tangle of circumstantial evidence and procedural oversight. He reminded the jury that justice was about doubt, not emotion. That men like Redmond built institutions, created jobs, served clients. He leaned on legacy, on tradition. But as his voice moved across the courtroom, it lacked gravity. Because the room knew, in its walls, its corners, its gallery benches, that the real tradition here had always been exclusion. And the face of that exclusion now sat in the defendant's chair. Amara didn't blink. She watched it all unfold with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime being overlooked only to return stronger each time. She wasn't moved by rhetoric. She was moved by rhythm, the rise and fall of truth when it is stripped of performance. When the jury retired to deliberate, a hush fell over the room. People filed out, conversations low and uncertain. The reporters left first, then the interns, then the curious. The lawyers remained behind, some pacing, others still at their tables pretending to review notes that had long since ceased to matter. Redmond didn't leave. He sat with his back straight, but his shoulders lower than they had been on the first day. He didn't look at Amara. Not anymore. He had stopped trying to find weakness in her. Now he seemed only to hope she wouldn't look back, that she would let him retreat quietly from the space he had once dominated. But Amara did look. Not with scorn. Not with pity. With presence. A kind of gaze that said, "I see you. Fully. And I am still here." She rose from the bench, signaling adjournment until the jury returned. The bailiff opened the door and Amara exited the courtroom, not through the private exit behind the bench, but through the main aisle, walking past the rows where she had once sat as a student, a clerk, a shadow. Every step forward was its own quiet rebellion. In her chambers, she stood for a long time without sitting. The windows let in a steady beam of sun now, slanting across her desk and illuminating the plaque with her name. Judge Amara Bell. The title was no longer foreign. It had settled onto her shoulders like something earned, not given. She walked to the bookshelf and let her fingers run across the spines. Legal history? Ethics? Precedent? She had read them all. But none had prepared her for this trial, not in content, but in what it represented. This case was not just about corruption. It was about reckoning. And reckoning always leaves bruises. When the knock came on the door, the moment returned. The jury was ready. She walked back into the courtroom. The jury was seated. The clerk stood with an envelope. The air went still. 12 people who had listened, watched, calculated. 12 people who had seen the evidence, but more importantly had seen the imbalance. The power games. The fear masked as certainty. The cruelty masked as law. Amara's eyes scanned each face. The foreman stood. The clerk received the slip. Silence. Then the verdict. Guilty. On all counts. No sound erupted. No gasps. No cheers. Just stillness. As if the room itself had stopped to recognize the meaning of what had just occurred. Charles Redmond didn't move. He didn't collapse or shout. He just sat there, staring forward. As the foundation of everything he had believed about his immunity crumbled beneath him, Amara nodded once. She did not smile. This was not about satisfaction. This was not about revenge. This was about law. Finally working the way it should. The court adjourned. The gavel came down once, firm. The room slowly emptied. Reporters would write. Commentators would argue. But the truth was simple. In the seat of judgment sat a woman who had once been told, "Your kind doesn't belong here." And now no one could take that seat from her. The courthouse was quieter the morning after the verdict. Rain tapped gently against the high windows, and the usual murmur of clerks and litigators felt muted, as though the building itself was still digesting what had happened within its walls. Newspapers lay folded on marble benches with headlines barely visible. Legal titan falls in courtroom shake-up. Judge Amara Bell delivers stunning verdict. A new face of justice. But for Amara, none of that mattered. Not the articles. Not the accolades. Not the congratulatory messages that had begun filling her inbox overnight. Her eyes weren't on what the world was saying now. They were on what the system might still resist tomorrow. She sat at her desk in chambers, reading through motions for unrelated cases. Petty theft, custody disputes, eviction appeals. Justice wasn't built in landmark moments alone. It lived in these quiet, overlooked details, in the places where no cameras pointed, where no reporters lingered. That was the work she had sworn to do. But even as she tried to return to the rhythm of law, she felt it, the shadow of Charles Redmond still hanging in the edges of thought. The look in his eyes as the verdict was read. Not disbelief, not rage, but a hollow resignation, the crumbling of a world in which he had always been untouchable. And beneath it, perhaps, a flicker of something else. Recognition. She hadn't thought she'd see that from him. But maybe, in the final seconds, he had seen her, not as a threat, not as an anomaly, but as what she was, the future. Her phone buzzed. A message from the court administrator. A new intern was arriving this morning. Law school, second year. Promising candidate. Would Amara be available for a brief introduction? She agreed, closed the file in front of her, and rose. Outside her chambers, the hallway stretched long and echoing. Portraits still lined the walls. Decades of white faces, stern and monochrome. She walked past them without pause, her heels tapping not as an intrusion, but as a declaration. She didn't need their validation. She had outgrown their approval. Near the clerk's desk stood a girl, young, unsure, clutching a leather folder too tightly against her chest. Her hair was natural and pinned back, and her suit didn't quite fit. She wore the expression Amara knew by heart, trying not to appear intimidated in a world built to make you feel small. Their eyes met. Amara didn't smile out of pity. She smiled in solidarity. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. A baton. A message. Promise. You belong. She welcomed the intern with the same grace she had never been shown at that age. She didn't lecture or instruct. She asked her about her goals, her coursework, her interests, and when she said she hoped one day to clerk for a judge, Amara only nodded and said, "We'll see to that." Later that day, Amara presided over a small claims dispute. No cameras, no headlines, just two people in conflict over a rental deposit. The kind of case most judges overlooked. But not her, because this too was justice, and all justice mattered. As she listened, ruled, and recorded the verdict, she felt none of the exhaustion others expected. Instead, She felt rooted, grounded. The bench wasn't a burden. It was a platform, and she had no intention of leaving it until she had reshaped it from within. As court recessed, she remained seated for a moment. The gallery had emptied. The attorneys had left. Only the janitor remained, sweeping near the back row. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Because dignity had no hierarchy in her courtroom. She stood, descended the steps, and exited not through the private hallway but through the same doors as the public. Each step down the marble stairwell felt different now, not lighter, but earned. Outside, the air smelled of wet concrete and faint blossoms. Across the street, traffic passed without pause, unaware of what had changed inside those walls. But change had come. She didn't need a parade. She didn't need applause. She just needed the door to stay open behind her, wide enough for all those still coming. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The buzz quieted. In the courthouse, the rhythm of justice continued its tireless march. Cases filed, motions heard, lives debated in sentences and statutes. The name Charles Redmond, once spoken with reverence, now appeared only in archived court logs and footnotes in ethics lectures. His portrait had been removed from the law school's donor wall. His biography on the firm's website vanished. What once seemed immovable now barely left a trace. But one name remained, steady and growing louder: Judge Amarabelle. Not because she demanded attention, she never did. But because in the void left by old power, people finally began to notice the shape of what had taken its place. Her days were no shorter, her desk no less cluttered. She still began early, still worked late, still pored over depositions and affidavits like each one carried the weight of a constitution. But something fundamental had changed. Not in the system. Not yet. In the people. In how they walked into her courtroom. In how they looked at the bench before looking away. In how the junior clerks sat straighter, the interns took notes with less fear, and how even the seasoned attorneys paused before speaking, not out of intimidation, but respect. The tremor wasn't in Amara. It was in the building. And it was spreading. Then came the request. A local university, the same one that had once denied her a full scholarship without explanation, had invited her to speak at their annual judicial ethics lecture. A formality, they called it. But beneath the polished wording was something else: acknowledgement. Not just of her position, but of her impact. Her precedent. She didn't answer right away. Not out of pride. Out of thought. Because Amarabelle never stepped into a room she hadn't considered from every angle. When the day arrived, the auditorium was full. Students, faculty, journalists, even rival judges. They had expected formality. She gave them truth. She didn't recount Redmond's downfall. She didn't center herself in the narrative. Instead, she spoke of structure, of the scaffolding of justice, and how it had long been built to elevate the same voices while silencing others. She spoke of her first courtroom job when she wasn't allowed to speak in meetings. She spoke of being mistaken for a defendant, a translator, a temp. And she spoke of the cost of remaining quiet. She ended not with applause, but with silence. A deliberate silence. The kind that forced thought. The kind that left room for something to begin. After the lecture, a line formed. Students, mostly. One by one they shook her hand, their eyes saying what words didn't. Not admiration. Not awe. Recognition. She returned to the courthouse that afternoon, back into her chambers, back to the cases that waited without ceremony. That was the thing about justice: it never paused, never celebrated, never waited. But that evening something unusual happened. She was asked to swear in a new judge. An older man, white-haired, from a small district. A good man. Fair. Honest. Experienced. He had specifically requested her. And so she did. She read the oath. Watched his hand rise. Watched his family beam. And then, after the formalities ended, he turned to her and with no one watching, with no cameras rolling, he said the words softly. They said you didn't belong here. But we needed you here more than we knew. She nodded. No more. No less. And when she returned to her bench the next morning, she passed by her own portrait for the first time, freshly mounted on the wall outside courtroom 6B. Her image framed in bronze and shadow, robe draped over her shoulders, gaze calm and resolute. She didn't stop. She didn't stare. She walked right past it. Because her legacy wasn't in the frame. It was in the foundation. And far beyond the bench, down the courthouse steps, out into the street, the ripple of her presence moved, invisible, quiet, and undeniable. Justice, real justice, had changed form. And now it looked like her.